3 months after the FBI raid, Jake Morrison was still adjusting to his new reality. The Henderson house remained empty, its windows boarded up as federal investigators continued processing evidence found throughout the property. What they had discovered during their thorough search exceeded even Agent Chin's expectations. Hidden in the basement was a sophisticated document production facility, complete with high-end printers, laminating machines, and computer equipment capable of accessing government databases through illegal means. The operation had been producing fake identities for clients across North America, with each complete identity package selling for between $5,000 and $15,000. Jake had spent considerable time in Denver giving depositions and working with federal prosecutors to build cases against not only the 4 people arrested at the Henderson house, but also the larger network they were part of. Through his testimony and the evidence he had collected, investigators had traced connections to similar operations in 12 other states. The Hendersons, Tom and Margaret, had indeed been victims of an elaborate recruiting scheme. They had been approached at a church social by a well-dressed woman who claimed to represent a company that helped people establish business addresses for online entrepreneurs. The woman had explained that many young people needed residential addresses to establish credit and start legitimate businesses, especially those who lived in apartments or moved frequently. The initial payments had been modest, just $500 per month to allow their address to be used for mail forwarding. But as the operation grew, so did the payments, eventually reaching several $1,000s monthly. By the time the Hendersons realized they were involved in something illegal, they were too frightened and too financially dependent to extract themselves easily. They kept telling us it was just helping young people get started in business, Margaret Henderson had explained to Jake during one of their supervised meetings. Tom's pension wasn't enough to cover our medical bills, and that extra money made such a difference. We never saw any harm in it until the FBI agents started asking questions. Tom Henderson, his health failing from the stress of the investigation, had been even more remorseful. "We should have known better, Jake. When something seems too good to be true, it usually is. But we were desperate, and we convinced ourselves we weren't hurting anyone." The couple had been charged with conspiracy but were allowed to plead guilty to lesser offenses in exchange for their cooperation. They received probation and substantial fines, but, more importantly, they were placed in a witness protection program after threats were made against their safety. Jake learned about these threats during a meeting with Agent Chun in January. The criminal organization behind the identity mill had suffered significant losses due to the exposure of their Wyoming operation, and they blamed Jake for initiating the investigation that brought down their network. "We've intercepted communications suggesting they might try to retaliate," Agent Chun warned him. "These aren't street criminals, Mr. Morrison. This organization has resources and connections. They've invested years building this network, and they're not happy about losing it." The FBI had installed a security system at Jake's ranch and provided him with a satellite phone for emergencies. They also arranged for periodic check-ins with local law enforcement and established protocols for Jake to follow if he noticed anything suspicious. But the threats weren't the only consequence of Jake's involvement in the case. Word had spread throughout the rural Wyoming community about what had happened at the Henderson place, and reactions were mixed. Some neighbors praised Jake for his vigilance and courage in exposing the criminal operation. Others felt he had violated the privacy of elderly neighbors and brought unwanted federal attention to their quiet community. "People don't like having FBI agents crawling all over their neighborhood," his neighbor Bill Watson had told him bluntly. "Makes folks nervous about their own business, even when they're not doing anything wrong." The controversy had affected Jake's relationships with several longtime friends and neighbors. Some viewed him as a hero who had protected the community from criminals. Others saw him as someone who had betrayed the trust of elderly neighbors and invited government interference in local affairs. Jake found himself caught between these opposing views, defending his actions to some while trying to explain his motivations to others. He had acted out of genuine concern for the Hendersons' welfare, but the consequences had reached far beyond what he had anticipated. The financial investigation had revealed just how extensive the criminal operation had been. Over 3 years, the identity mill using the Henderson address had generated more than $2 million in fraudulent transactions. Credit cards had been opened in the names of fake identities, loans had been taken out using stolen social security numbers, and elaborate tax fraud schemes had been perpetrated using the false documents. The victims of these crimes numbered in the hundreds. Real people had discovered their credit destroyed by accounts they never opened. Others had been audited by the IRS for income they never earned. Some had been arrested for crimes committed by people using their stolen identities. Jake had met some of these victims during the court proceedings, and their stories had reinforced his conviction that exposing the operation had been the right thing to do. A young teacher in Colorado had spent 2 years fighting to clear her name after someone using her social security number had been arrested for drug trafficking. An elderly man in Montana had lost his life savings when criminals used his identity to take out loans against his property. "What you did saved my family from financial ruin," the teacher had told Jake after one court session. If that operation had continued, who knows how many more people would have been hurt. These encounters helped Jake deal with the local criticism he faced. While some of his neighbors questioned his methods, he knew that hundreds of innocent victims had been protected by his actions. As spring arrived in Wyoming, Jake began to notice signs that his life was slowly returning to normal. The FBI surveillance of his property had been scaled back, and Agent Chin's visits had become less frequent. The immediate threat from the criminal organization seemed to have diminished as law enforcement continued to arrest members of their network across the country. The Henderson house had finally been released by federal investigators, and Jake learned that it would be sold to satisfy the fines and restitution orders against Tom and Margaret Henderson. The elderly couple would not be returning to Wyoming. Their health had suffered during the stress of the investigation, and they had decided to move closer to their daughter in Colorado. Jake felt sad about losing neighbors he had genuinely cared about, despite the circumstances that had complicated their relationship. He had visited them several times during the legal proceedings, and both had expressed gratitude for his concern about their welfare, even though his actions had ultimately led to their legal troubles. "You did what any good neighbor would do," Tom Henderson had told him during their last meeting. "We just wish we had been smarter about what we got ourselves into." The new owners of the Henderson property turned out to be a young family from Denver who wanted to raise their children in a rural setting. Jake met them during their first week in the house, and was pleased to find them friendly and genuine. The husband, David, was a computer programmer who could work remotely, and his wife, Lisa, was a teacher who had found a job at the local elementary school. "We heard about what happened here," Lisa had told Jake honestly. "But that's in the past. We just want to be good neighbors and be part of the community." Their 2 children, ages 7 and 9, reminded Jake of himself at that age, eager to explore their new surroundings and fascinated by ranch life. He found himself looking forward to teaching them about horses and cattle, activities that would help restore some normalcy to his daily routine. The legal proceedings continued throughout the spring and into the summer. Jake testified in multiple trials as prosecutors worked to convict not only the local operators, but also the organizers of the broader criminal network. The evidence he had collected by taking in the Henderson mail became crucial in establishing the timeline and scope of the illegal activities. Agent Chin kept Jake informed about the progress of the investigation. "Your evidence helped us trace this network back to its origins in Eastern Europe," she explained during one of their meetings. "We've identified the leaders and are working with international law enforcement to disrupt their other operations." The scope of the criminal enterprise had been staggering. The Identity Mill network had operated in 17 countries and had generated an estimated $50 million in fraudulent transactions over 5 years. The Wyoming operation had been just one small piece of a global criminal organization that preyed on vulnerable people in rural communities. By late summer, most of the local prosecutions had been completed. The 4 people arrested at the Henderson house had all been convicted and sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 5 to 12 years. The evidence Jake provided had been instrumental in securing these convictions. But the most satisfying outcome for Jake came from an unexpected source. In August, he received a letter from the National Association of Rural Law Enforcement, informing him that he would be receiving their Citizen Service Award for his role in exposing the identity theft network. "Your vigilance and cooperation with law enforcement prevented countless additional victims from suffering financial harm," the letter stated. Your actions exemplify the best traditions of community responsibility and civic duty. The award ceremony was held at the state capitol, and Jake was surprised to find himself sharing the stage with Agent Chun and several other law enforcement officials who had worked on the case. The governor presented him with a plaque and praised his courage in coming forward with evidence that had led to such significant criminal prosecutions. Sometimes ordinary citizens find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, the governor said in his remarks. Mr. Morrison could have chosen to mind his own business, but instead he chose to protect his community and his fellow citizens. As Jake drove home from the ceremony, he reflected on the journey that had begun with his simple decision to collect his neighbor's mail. What had started as an act of neighborly concern had evolved into a federal investigation that exposed a major criminal network and protected hundreds of innocent victims from financial harm. The experience had changed him in ways he was still discovering. He had learned that even in rural Wyoming, far from major cities, organized crime could establish operations that affected people across the globe. He had learned that good intentions sometimes led to complicated consequences, and that doing the right thing didn't always make you popular with everyone. Most importantly, he had learned that individual citizens could make a difference in fighting crime and protecting their communities. His decision to pay attention to suspicious activity and report it to proper authorities had ultimately prevented millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions and helped dismantle a sophisticated criminal organization. As he pulled into his driveway and saw the lights on in the Henderson house, now home to the young family who had moved in, Jake felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal achievement. His community was safer because of his actions, and hundreds of people across the country had been protected from becoming victims of identity theft. The mail had stopped coming to the Henderson address months ago, and the criminals who had used it for their illegal activities were now in federal prison. Jake's daily routine had returned to normal, but he remained more alert to unusual activities in his neighborhood. He had learned that vigilant citizens were one of the best defenses against sophisticated criminals who preyed on rural communities. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jake thought about the chain of events that had changed his life. A simple act of neighborly kindness had led him into a world of federal investigations and international crime, but it had also reinforced his belief in the importance of looking out for one another. The abandoned mail that had started it all was now evidence in federal lockup, but its discovery had taught Jake and his community valuable lessons about staying vigilant and protecting one another from those who would exploit their trust and generosity. In the end, taking in his neighbor's mail had indeed changed everything, not just for Jake, but for hundreds of victims who might never know his name but who had been protected by his decision to care about what happened in his small corner of Wyoming. Jake barely slept that night. Every sound outside his window made him jump, wondering if someone was coming to collect the mail he had intercepted. He had resealed the package as carefully as possible and placed it back with the other suspicious letters, but the knowledge of what it contained burned in his mind like a brand. When dawn broke over the mountains, Jake made coffee with shaking hands and tried to think clearly about his situation. He had always been a man who solved problems with direct action, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. Calling the sheriff seemed like the obvious choice, but Deputy Martinez would want to know how Jake had discovered the fake identities. Opening federal mail carried serious penalties, and Jake couldn't afford to lose his ranch over legal troubles. He decided to continue collecting the mail for a few more days, hoping to gather more evidence without breaking any more laws. Maybe there would be something in the regular deliveries that would give him the proof he needed to go to the authorities without admitting to his crime. Over the next week, Jake's daily trips to the Henderson mailbox became exercises in careful observation. He noted every car that passed on the rural road, memorized license plates, and watched for anyone who seemed too interested in the abandoned house. The mail continued to arrive in alarming volumes, confirming that the Henderson address was being used by multiple people for various illegal purposes. On Friday afternoon, Jake's vigilance paid off in a way he hadn't expected. As he sorted through the day's delivery in his kitchen, he found an envelope that made his stomach drop. It was addressed to him, Jake Morrison, at his own ranch address. But He hadn't been to his own mailbox yet that day. Someone had deliberately placed this letter among the Henderson mail. The envelope was plain white with no return address, and his name was written in block letters that looked deliberately disguised. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message: "Stop collecting the mail or face the consequences. You don't know what you're dealing with." Jake read the note 3 times, his anger growing with each reading. Someone had been watching him, knew about his daily trips to collect the mail, and was now threatening him. The implication was clear. The people behind the identity theft ring were still active, still monitoring their operation, and they saw Jake as a threat. But the note also told Jake something important. If the criminals were worried enough to threaten him, it meant they planned to return to the Henderson house. They wouldn't abandon such a profitable operation without a fight. Jake realized he might be the only thing standing between them and the continuation of their illegal activities. That evening, Jake made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He wasn't going to be intimidated by criminals, and he wasn't going to let them continue using his community for their illegal schemes. But he also wasn't going to handle this alone. Instead of going to the local sheriff, who might be required to arrest Jake for mail tampering, he would contact the FBI directly. Jake had never called the FBI before, but he found their Denver office number online and dialed it Saturday morning. After being transferred several times, he was connected to Special Agent Sarah Chun, who specialized in identity theft cases. The irony of her last name, matching one of the fake identities he had discovered, wasn't lost on him. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Chun said after Jake explained his situation, "what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated identity mill. These operations often use residential addresses in rural areas because they're less likely to attract attention. The fact that someone threatened you suggests this is a significant operation." Jake hesitated, then decided to tell her about opening the package. "Agent Chun, I need to be honest with you about something. I opened one of their packages. I know that was wrong, but I was worried about my neighbor's safety." There was a pause on the line before Agent Chun responded. "Mr. Morrison, under normal circumstances, tampering with mail would be a serious issue. However, if you're willing to cooperate with our investigation and testify about what you found, we might be able to work something out. The information you've uncovered could be crucial to shutting down this operation." Relief flooded through Jake's chest. "What do you need me to do?" "First, I need you to stop collecting the mail immediately. We're going to set up surveillance on the Henderson property and monitor who comes and goes. Second, I need you to document everything you've found so far. Make copies of anything that looks important, but don't open any more packages. Third, be very careful. If these people are willing to threaten you, they might escalate to more serious measures." Agent Chin arranged to meet Jake at his ranch the following Monday. She would bring a team to examine the evidence he had collected and begin setting up the surveillance operation. Jake spent the weekend organizing every piece of suspicious mail he had found, creating a detailed log of dates and contents. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the first snow of winter dusting the mountain peaks. Agent Chin arrived in an unmarked sedan with 2 other agents, a man she introduced as Agent Rodriguez and a woman named Agent Williams. They spread Jake's collection of mail across his dining room table and began photographing and cataloging each piece. "This is impressive work, Mr. Morrison," Agent Chin said as she examined the fake driver's licenses from the open package. "These are high-quality forgeries. The people behind this operation have access to sophisticated equipment and government databases." Agent Rodriguez, who had been studying the financial documents, looked up from a stack of bank statements. "The money trail here is substantial. These accounts show movements of hundreds of thousands of dollars. This isn't some small-time operation." As the agents worked, Jake learned more about what he had stumbled into. The Henderson address was part of what law enforcement called a ghost address network, where criminals rented or purchased the use of residential addresses to establish fake identities. These identities were then used for everything from credit card fraud to money laundering to immigration violations. "The beauty of using elderly rural residents," Agent Williams explained, "is that they often have established reputations in their communities. Neighbors trust them, local businesses know them, and they're less likely to attract scrutiny from law enforcement." But Jake's discovery raised questions about the Hendersons themselves. Had they been coerced into participating, or were they willing partners in the scheme? The payment confirmation letter suggested they were being compensated for their cooperation, but elderly people were often targets of sophisticated scams themselves. "We need to find the Hendersons," Agent Chin said. "They might be victims, but they might also be key witnesses or even co-conspirators. Either way, their testimony will be crucial for building a case." The agents set up a sophisticated surveillance system around the Henderson property, using cameras hidden in trees and motion sensors along the driveway. They also established a monitoring post in an abandoned hunting cabin about a mile away, where they could observe the house without being detected. Jake was given a special radio to contact the surveillance team if he noticed anything unusual. His role was to continue his normal ranch activities while keeping an eye on the Henderson property. The agents emphasized that he should not try to confront anyone who might show up at the house. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Jake went about his daily routine of caring for his cattle and maintaining his property, but he found it difficult to concentrate on normal tasks. Every time he rode past the Henderson place, he expected to see signs of activity, but the house remained dark and empty. Then, on a Thursday night in mid-November, Jake was awakened by the sound of vehicles on the gravel road. He looked out his bedroom window and saw headlights turning into the Henderson driveway. 2 cars, moving slowly with their lights dimmed, approached the house. Jake grabbed the radio and whispered into it, "This is Jake. 2 vehicles just arrived at the Henderson place." Agent Chin's voice crackled back immediately. "We see them. Stay inside and keep watching. Tell us what you observe, but do not leave your house under any circumstances." Through his binoculars, Jake watched as 4 people got out of the cars and approached the house. They were dressed in dark clothing and moved with the confidence of people who belonged there. One of them produced keys and unlocked the front door while the others began unloading boxes from the vehicles. "They're bringing stuff into the house," Jake reported. "Looks like they're setting up shop again." For the next 2 hours, Jake provided updates to the surveillance team as the criminals moved equipment and supplies into the Henderson house. Lights came on in several rooms, and through the windows, Jake could see people working at tables, apparently resuming their identity theft operations. At midnight, Agent Chin's voice came over the radio with instructions that made Jake's pulse quicken. "Mr. Morrison, we're going to move in at dawn. These people are resuming operations, which gives us the probable cause we need for arrests. Stay alert, and if anything changes before morning, let us know immediately." Jake spent the remainder of the night watching the house, documenting the criminals' activities and fighting the urge to saddle his horse and ride over there himself. His rancher's instincts told him to confront the trespassers directly, but his rational mind knew that would only complicate the FBI's operation. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the mountains, Jake saw Agent Chin's surveillance team moving into position around the Henderson property. Agents in tactical gear surrounded the house, while others blocked the driveway with unmarked vehicles. The raid was swift and decisive. Jake watched through his binoculars as the FBI agents entered the house and emerged minutes later with 4 suspects in handcuffs. The operation that had been using his neighborhood for illegal activities was finally being shut down. But even as Jake felt relief at seeing the criminals arrested, he knew that many questions remained unanswered. Where were the Hendersons? Were they victims or willing participants? And, most importantly, how many other rural addresses across the country were being used for similar operations? Agent Chin arrived at Jake's ranch later that morning with news that was both encouraging and troubling. The arrested suspects were talking, hoping to negotiate reduced sentences in exchange for information about the larger network they worked for. "What they're telling us suggests this operation was much bigger than we initially thought," she explained. The Henderson address was just one of dozens being used across several states. "We're looking at a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise." The suspects had confirmed that the Hendersons were willing participants who had been recruited through what appeared to be a legitimate business opportunity. They had been promised easy money for simply allowing their address to be used for business purposes. What they hadn't understood was the true nature of those business purposes until they were already deeply involved. "The good news is that we found the Hendersons," Agent Chen continued. "They're in a safe house in Denver, cooperating with our investigation. They were scared and trying to figure out how to get out of the situation when your mail collecting made the criminals nervous. Jake felt a mixture of relief and sadness at this news. His elderly neighbors had been manipulated by sophisticated criminals who preyed on people's financial insecurities. But their cooperation with law enforcement suggested they wanted to make things right. The evidence Jake had collected by taking in his neighbor's mail had become the foundation for a federal investigation that would ultimately expose a nationwide identity theft ring. His simple act of neighborly concern had uncovered a criminal operation that was stealing millions of dollars from innocent victims across the country. But as Agent Chin packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, she gave Jake a warning that chilled him to the bone. The people we arrested were just the local operators. The leaders of this organization are still out there, and they don't like losing profitable operations. You might want to consider installing some security measures around your ranch. Jake looked out at the Henderson house, which was now wrapped in yellow crime scene tape, and would remain empty for the foreseeable future. His quiet rural neighborhood had been invaded by big city crime, and even though the immediate threat was over, the sense of safety he had always taken for granted was gone forever. The mail that had started this entire adventure was now evidence in a federal case, and Jake realized that his testimony would be needed in court proceedings that could last for months or even years. His simple life as a Wyoming rancher had become complicated in ways he never could have imagined, all because he had cared enough about his neighbors to collect their abandoned mail. Jake Morrison had been living on his ranch in Wyoming for 15 years, and he thought he knew everything about his neighbors. The Hendersons lived in the house next to his property line, an elderly couple who kept to themselves, but always waved when they saw him fixing fences or herding cattle. That's why it struck him as strange when their mailbox started overflowing. At first, Jake didn't think much of it. Maybe they were on vacation, or perhaps Mr. Henderson was having trouble getting to the mailbox after his hip surgery last spring. Jake had offered to help with chores before, but the old man was proud and always insisted he could manage just fine. The mailbox sat at the end of their long driveway, about a quarter-mile from their house, right next to where Jake's own driveway met the main road. Days passed, and the mail kept piling up. Letters, packages, and magazines stuffed the box until the door wouldn't even close properly. Some pieces had fallen to the ground, scattered by the wind across the gravel road. Jake found himself looking toward the Henderson place more often during his daily rounds, checking for signs of life. Their old blue pickup truck hadn't moved from its usual spot beside the house, and no lights appeared in the windows after dark. On a Tuesday morning in late October, Jake rode his horse along the fence line that separated his property from theirs. The autumn air was crisp, and his breath formed small clouds as he checked for loose wire and damaged posts. From this vantage point, he could see the Henderson house clearly. The curtains were drawn tight, and newspapers had accumulated on the front porch. A sick feeling settled in his stomach. Jake had always been the kind of man who minded his own business. His father had taught him that good neighbors respect boundaries and don't go poking around where they don't belong. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. The Hendersons were in their 70s, and while they were generally healthy, anything could happen at their age. What if one of them had fallen and couldn't get help? What if they were both lying inside, unable to call for assistance? He decided to ride over and knock on their door just to check. As his horse picked its way across the rough ground between the properties, Jake rehearsed what he would say. He didn't want to seem like he was prying, but he also couldn't shake the worry that had been growing stronger each day. The Henderson house was a modest single-story home, painted white with green shutters. Mrs. Henderson had always kept flower boxes under the windows, filled with bright petunias and marigolds during the warmer months. Now, in late fall, the boxes contained only withered stems and dried leaves. Jake tied his horse to the fence post and walked up the gravel path to the front door. He knocked firmly 3 times and waited. No answer. He tried again, calling out, "Mr. Henderson? Mrs. Henderson? It's Jake Morrison from next door." Still nothing. Jake walked around to the back of the house and peered through a gap in the kitchen curtains. The sink was full of dishes, and mail was scattered across the kitchen table. Everything looked frozen in time, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-task. Growing more concerned, Jake returned to his ranch and called the sheriff's office. Deputy Martinez arrived within an hour, and together they entered the Henderson house through the unlocked back door. The search didn't take long. The house was empty, but it was clear that the Hendersons had left in a hurry. Clothes were still in the dresser drawers, food remained in the refrigerator, and a half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the coffee table beside Mr. Henderson's reading glasses. Deputy Martinez found a note on the kitchen counter, hastily written in Mrs. Henderson's shaky handwriting. Gone to Denver. Emergency with Sarah. We'll call when we can. Sarah was their daughter, Jake remembered. She lived in Colorado and rarely visited. Looks like they had to leave suddenly, the deputy said, folding the note and putting it in his pocket. Family emergency. It happens with older folks sometimes. Their kids need help, and they drop everything to go. Jake nodded, but something still bothered him. Why hadn't they asked him to collect their mail? They knew he was a trustworthy neighbor. Why leave so abruptly without telling anyone? And why hadn't they contacted the post office to hold their deliveries? After the deputy left, Jake stood in his kitchen looking out the window toward the Henderson place. The house looked lonely and abandoned, its empty windows staring back at him like vacant eyes. He made a decision. Whether the Hendersons had asked for help or not, he was going to take care of their mail. It was the neighborly thing to do, and it would give him peace of mind. The next morning, Jake drove his pickup truck to the end of the Hendersons' driveway and began collecting the accumulated mail. There were bills, advertising circulars, magazines, and several packages. He loaded everything into a cardboard box he'd brought from home and drove back to his ranch. His plan was simple. Sort through everything, set aside anything that looked important, and store the rest until the Hendersons returned. Jake spread the mail across his dining room table and began organizing it by type. Bills went in one pile, personal letters in another, and junk mail in a third. As he worked, he noticed that some of the letters were addressed to names he didn't recognize. There were several pieces for someone named Robert Shun, and others for Maria Santos. Jake double-checked the return addresses, thinking maybe the postal service had made a mistake, but they were all clearly meant for the Henderson address. Among the packages was a small box addressed to Margaret Henderson, but the return address made Jake frown. It was from a law office in Denver, the same city where their daughter lived. The package felt heavy for its size, and something rattled inside when he picked it up. Jake set it aside with the other important-looking items. As he continued sorting, a pattern began to emerge that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Mixed in with the Hendersons' regular mail were documents that suggested other people had been using their address. There was a bank statement for Robert Shun, showing a checking account with over $50,000. There was a credit card application for Maria Santos, and several letters from various government agencies addressed to names Jake had never heard before. The most disturbing discovery came when he opened what looked like a routine utility bill. Inside was a notice from the electric company, but it wasn't addressed to the Hendersons. It was for someone named David Kim, and it was a final disconnect notice for non-payment. The strange thing was, Jake knew the power was still on at the Henderson house because he could see the porch light burning at night. Jake sat back in his chair, pieces of mail scattered around him like evidence of some unknown crime. What had the Hendersons gotten themselves into? Were they allowing other people to use their address for some reason? Was this some kind of mail fraud scheme? The possibility that his elderly neighbors might be involved in something illegal seemed impossible, but the evidence was right there on his table. He picked up the package from the law office again, turning it over in his hands. The rational part of his mind told him to leave it alone, to simply store everything until the Hendersons came back, and let them deal with whatever was going on. But another part of him, the part that had been worried about their safety, wondered if this package might contain answers about where they had gone and why. Jake had always prided himself on being an honest man. He paid his taxes, treated his animals well, and never took anything that didn't belong to him. Opening someone else's mail was a federal crime. He knew that much. But what if the Hendersons were in trouble? What if they were being used by criminals who had somehow gained access to their address? What if they didn't even know what was happening? The internal debate continued as Jake made himself dinner and tried to focus on the evening news. But his eyes kept drifting to the dining room table where the mysterious mail waited. The package from the law office seemed to call to him. promising answers to questions that were keeping him awake at night. Finally, as the sun set behind the mountains and darkness settled over his ranch, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He walked to the dining room, picked up the package, and carefully examined the sealing tape. If he was very careful, he might be able to open it and reseal it without anyone knowing. It was wrong, he knew that. But if there was even a chance that the Hendersons needed help, he had to take that chance. The package opened easily, revealing a smaller box inside packed with tissue paper. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the contents. What he found inside made his blood run cold and confirmed his worst fears about what had been happening at the Henderson place. Nestled in the tissue paper was a collection of items that didn't belong to any elderly couple from Wyoming. There were several driver's licenses, all with different names, but the same address, the Henderson address. There were credit cards, social security cards, and what appeared to be birth certificates. All of the documents looked official, but Jake's instincts told him they were sophisticated fakes. At the bottom of the box was a letter from the law office, written on official letterhead. Jake read it with growing horror. The letter was addressed to Margaret Henderson, but it wasn't about any family emergency. Instead, it was a payment confirmation for services rendered in the amount of $25,000. The letter thanked Mrs. Henderson for her continued cooperation and mentioned that the next shipment would arrive within 2 weeks. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. The Hendersons weren't victims of a scam. They were active participants in what appeared to be an identity theft operation. Their quiet, unassuming home was being used as a base for creating fake identities, and they were being paid handsomely for their cooperation. But where were they now? Had they fled because they knew the authorities were getting close? Or had something gone wrong with their criminal partners? The hastily written note about a family emergency suddenly seemed like a cover story, a way to buy time before anyone discovered what they had been doing. Jake carefully repacked the box, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had found. He was holding evidence of what appeared to be a major identity theft ring, but he had obtained that evidence by committing a federal crime himself. If he went to the authorities, he would have to admit that he had opened someone else's mail. But if he didn't report what he had found, the criminals might get away with their scheme. As he sat in his kitchen, staring out at the dark Henderson house, Jake realized that his simple act of neighborly kindness had drawn him into a web of crime and deception that was far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The question now was what to do with the knowledge that was burning a hole in his conscience. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of snow from the mountains. Winter was coming early this year, and Jake had the feeling that the cold months ahead were going to be unlike any he had ever experienced. The mail he had collected out of concern for his neighbors had revealed secrets that would change not only his understanding of the Hendersons, but his entire sense of safety and security in the place he had always called home. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to be a law-abiding citizen who reported what he had found, or a neighbor who protected the people he had once trusted. Either choice would have consequences he couldn't predict, but one thing was certain: his quiet life as a Wyoming rancher would never be the same again.